The G7 has come a long way since its inception in the mid-1970s. It was the initiative of then French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. It was formed to discuss the world economy and consult on an international economic policy following the first oil shock and the collapse of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system. But by the 1980s, the G7 had began embracing foreign and security policy issues. The apogee of the G7 as the high table on international security was probably reached in 1991, when the G7 invited Mikhail Gorbachev to talks in London in 1991, parallel to the G7 summit. In 1998, Russia was formally admitted to the group, making it the G8. For the next decade and a half, Russia began regularly attending the summit meetings until 2013, when a parting of ways came following the color revolution in Ukraine, and the G8 reverted to G7. Since then, G7 has behaved unabashedly as an exclusive Western club. This much recap is useful and necessary to recall how this intensely political platform of 7 Western countries came to nurture such notions of exceptionalism. But today, facing a world in transition, they are apprehensive that the world of yesterday is drifting away. In a dramatic role reversal since the 1970s, the developing world now accounts for almost 2/3 of the global economy compared with 1/3 by the West. Of course, this reality, which surged during the 2008 financial crisis, in turn, led to the birth of the more representative G20, but the G7 refuses to retrench. The pandemic may be exacerbating this historic shift. Overall, the Western powers are in a state of trauma as they look around and sense that the sort of dominance they enjoyed as overlords by virtue of their grip on the world economy is no longer feasible. By any reckoning, the G7 leaders who gathered in Britain in the weekend for the summit meeting, which concluded on Sunday, were conscious of the undercurrents swirling around them. The G7 is under compulsion to reinvent itself. However, there are signs of disunity amongst the G7 countries in regard of an anti-China crusade. China is a driver of growth for the world economy and has even reconfigured some of the Western economies. Herein lies the paradox. One of the outcomes of the latest G7 summit is supposedly a Western countermove to address the infrastructure financing gap by mobilizing private sector capital and expertise. But where does the G7 money come from? Their economies are mired in debt. And why should their private sector companies borrow unless there are commensurate returns? By the first quarter of 2020, the value of China's Belt and Road projects already exceeded $4 trillion. These are hard realities. The G7 has also brought to the front that there is sharp disagreement among the United States and its allies about how to respond to China's rising power. The two major European powers, Germany and France, does not see eye to eye as to whether to regard China as a partner, competitor, adversary or outright security threat. This mood swing will stall the U.S. efforts to muster a comprehensive Western response. In the near term, the litmus test will be whether the Biden administration can persuade the allies to denounce China's use of forced labor and take concrete downstream actions to ensure that global supply chains are free from the use of Chinese labor. At the end of the day, the laws of economics are stronger than the geopolitical constructs or human rights concerns. President of the European Council, Charles Michel, defended the European Union's efforts to negotiate a comprehensive agreement on investment with China by calling the investment deal a huge step in the right direction. He told reporters, "For the first time we are making a step to facilitate investment by European companies in the Chinese economy." The timing of the remark was rather delicate and intriguing, even as Biden was taking off for his European tour. It signified that much as the China-EU economic ties are in a complicated transitional phase, that's not an excuse for the US to put its finger in the pie. More importantly, it underlines that neither the EU nor China wants to see US interference making things worse and less predictable. On the other hand, of course, the Europeans wouldn't like to lose their policy independence and become a pawn in the US containment against China. This is only to be expected, as in 2020, China has overtaken the US as the EU's largest trading partner. The trade in goods and services between China and European countries reached nearly $1 trillion, with two-way cumulative investments exceeding $250 billion. A survey released by the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China showed on Tuesday that nearly 60% of European companies plan to expand their businesses in China this year, an increase of nearly 10 percentage points from the 51% surveyed last year. Suffice to say, Europeans are savvy enough to know that politicization of China-EU economic ties will be detrimental to their long-term interests. The European countries have their own plans, while welcoming the US leadership and resuscitating transatlanticism, but not jeopardizing their cooperation with China. They will tread softly regarding Washington's calls to crack down on China. Cooperation in the business circles will not be dented because enterprises will vote with their feet. The CNN reported that the 7 leaders aired serious differences over how best to approach China during a session of the G7 summit, with Germany and Italy in particular, as well as European Union leaders, opposed to dealing with China in a confrontational manner. Equally, Europeans are well aware that the trade war hurt the US badly. According to a study by Oxford Economics in January this year, the cost of the trade war for the US was around 0.5% of GDP in 2018 to 2019, an estimated 245,000 jobs, and $88 billion in real household income. If the scenario escalates, the US GDP will shrink by $1.6 trillion over the next 5 years and result in 732,000 fewer jobs in the US in 2022. Indeed, the Biden administration too realizes that merely seeking conflicts with China, or being blindly hardline, is unwise, as the US still needs to coordinate with China regarding issues like trade and regional order. The US is aware that if it crosses China's red line on the Taiwan question, there is going to be a heavier price to pay at the cost of US-owned interests. Basically, it is hoping to hold Beijing in play without risking the US long-term interests. That is to say, for all practical purposes, the Biden administration is respecting China's red line and wants to maintain flexibility in its handling of overall relationship with Beijing. This is very important, as both sides know that the Taiwan question is the most vital indicator for Beijing to observe the momentum of the China-US relations. Meanwhile, even as the US ramped up Cold War idiom against China at the G7, China unrolled a potent countermeasure of its own. Last Thursday, China's top legislature passed the anti-foreign sanction law, the first one of its kind, providing strong legal support and guarantees for China against unilateral and discriminatory measures imposed by other countries. The new law empowers China's State Council to create its own sanctions on any organization or individual that participates in the formulation, decision-making or implementations of sanctions against China. Effectively, this gives Beijing the legal framework to target entities that willfully damage China's reputation through smear campaigns. Clearly, this move testifies to an increasingly confident China on the international stage. If China previously lacked the economic power or political will to retaliate against US sanctions, it now has that capability. Historically, China only retaliated against sanctions through countermeasures on case-by-case basis. But China is now entering the sanctions game, making it clear that the US and its allies no longer will have a monopoly over sanctions as an instrument to impose on China their specific political values. By Friday, President Xi Jinping already signed the bill into law in a big signal to the G7 summit that even hysterical tirades or smear campaign, such as the Wuhan lab hypothesis, in an orchestrated way, could entail Chinese sanctions. According to the China Central Television, Blinken too acknowledged during his phone call with Yang on the eve of the Cornwall summit that the series of contacts between the US and China in the most recent weeks are beneficial to bilateral relations, and the US is looking forward to increasing contact and exchanges with China at all levels. All empirical evidence is stacked against a Western coordinated move, leave alone a unified hostile action against China. The bottom line is that, while European countries may have systemic differences with China, their economic relations with China are competitive and they also have strategic needs for cooperation. That's all for this video. Peace. Like, share and subscribe to this channel for similar content.